My name is Tiffany. I'm the founder of Spill Stories, and I'm based in Hong Kong. Spill Stories is a storytelling platform uniting women of color. We focus on stories related to race, culture, feminism, body positivity, all different topics that would resonate with women of color. A lot of the time when we talk about women of color, this is a phrase that's from the United States and it's founded by Black women. So just to make it clear, for an Asian context, we are trying to promote voices of women who have histories and heritages involving oppression in the form of colonialism, imperialism, slavery. So basically non-white women. And it's not to say that, we don't enjoy the stories that white women have to share, but this is just a safe space where we can highlight other points of view.
Rains down, we'll be okay, I promise. We won't stay down.
Moving to Hong Kong really made me take another hard look at my place. I think there were a couple of events that caused me to be a little more interested in talking about race and engaging other people about race. Mostly like events in 2016, like Trump's election or Brexit, really made me reflect on my identity. And then also, I think living in Hong Kong in a post-colonial society also made me really interested in race. So I think the work that I've done through Spill Stories is just an homage to amplifying the voices of women whose perspectives are not usually heard and whose heritages involve, some forms of like oppression, whether it's slavery, colonialism, imperialism, etc. Yeah.
Invest in my time, hope someday these melodies pay off to remedy pain, dog. Reminiscing on the hard times when bread and butter was the recipe.
The approach I've always taken with Spill Stories is to drive empathy through personal stories. Because I feel like in an age where there's so much polarization and people are, always sharing their opinions about social issues on the internet, there's really like a lack of space for people to just share their personal stories in an honest and vulnerable way. Like sometimes when you talk about social issues on the internet, it kind of feels like both sides are just kind of screaming at each other. So I guess I've always loved to write ever since I was a kid. And I've always thought about writing as a tool for self-expression, but also learning something that you didn't know before or like changing your mind about somebody. And so I think like the use of personal narratives is what I think can really help people learn about something new. So I work full-time outside of Spill Stories, so it's really tough to find time to commit. But I hope that I can still curate interesting topics that people would want to write into and taking a really intersectional approach that crosses racial lines, and to curate content, whether it's in the form of books or, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is podcasting, or maybe it's through events, so hoping to just create good content that people want to read, or digest. Yeah.
I see you questioning the lifestyle, like you're better than me. I ain't no hypocrite.
Stuff like racism and colorism, after all, so I'll just speak from an Asian American's perspective, right? I just want to make this clear. Like, when I see stuff like Black Lives Matter and all the stuff that came up on social media was like, talking about how, racism is bad and like, don't be a racist. And like, I feel like the conversation should actually start a couple steps earlier. So it's not about ignoring colorism or ignoring race. It's about actually acknowledging like the way that we see race, first of all, in ourselves, right? And then thinking about deeply evaluating the way we see other people and where those kind of beliefs come from. So I openly, and I tell people like, one thing that's been difficult to think about is like how I grew up in a pretty racist culture, right? And like I have my own embedded racism because I grew up in that culture. And I think we need to be able to confess that to each other before we actually move forward, right? Like, who are we kidding? Like, you're just magically not racist after growing up in Asia? Like, of course not. You know, if your parents had certain values, if your grandparents had certain values, if your educators didn't focus on race, of course you inherited these beliefs. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that there's work for you to do, right? And I feel like unless we are able to like humbly admit that, like, then we can't really go anywhere, because you're just trying to prove to each other that you're not racist when everybody has their own form of racism. So yeah, I just hope that people, you know, can use these stories to actually reflect on themselves more so than, you know, being a big, like, you know, woke activist, right? Like, sometimes you don't need to do that. Like, if you yourself have a lot of processing to do. So that's what I'm hoping, you know, the book can accomplish at the bare minimum. Yeah, so I was born in Boston, and then I grew up in Taipei from 6 to 16. Yeah. And then after that, I finished off high school in Omaha, Nebraska, where I was one of like the few Asian kids in the entire school, which was a very definitive experience. And then I went to school at the University of Michigan, studied business, and then worked in Chicago for 3.5 years before moving to Hong Kong. I think my parents have their own points of view around race, right? Like back when I was talking about inheriting, you know, certain beliefs, my parents, I think, are pretty progressive compared to their prior generation, but there's still a lot of things that they don't understand. But I do want to point out there's this really beautiful story because, you know, when Black Lives Matter, you know, started heating up this year, I tried to engage my parents about it, and I was met with a lot of resistance because they basically have some, let's just call it, some very uninformed opinions about Black people, okay? And so, you know, we would always get into these points of tension where I would kind of like argue with them, be like, why don't you understand this? Like, systemic inequality is a real thing. And they would always like have this retort. And I just felt like at one point I could never get my point across. But then we were hosting a party for Black in Asia in Taipei. And because some Taiwanese people were coming to the event, we thought, okay, we need to translate the stories, at least the stories that are being read. And I needed a translator very last minute. And so I turned to my parents and I said, hey, can you please translate these stories? I need them like basically tomorrow. You know, who do you call when you really need something? It's your parents, right? And I think what's really beautiful is that they actually translated the stories. As two people who like have these kind of backwards views on race, they're actually the ones who like took out the effort and like stayed up all night and translated the stories of like two Black women. And so other Taiwanese people could read the stories. So I think when we think about the work, you know, when you're like informing people about race, it comes in different forms, right? It's like sometimes it's not an angry conversation. Sometimes it's just them helping or doing something that helps them think in a different way.
I promise we won't stay down.
Back in the days when I was young, I'm not a kid anymore. Some days I sit and wish I was a kid again. Friends hollering, can I play out? And not coming back to the Jay said I couldn't stay out when your street was the playground. And making sure your chores are all done so you get your friends to stay round. Those were the good days, man. Those were the good days, and best believe I can't leave out secondary. Some of the memories from back then were legendary. Water fights had you in class, soaked to the bone, excited for round two before you went home. Playing penny up the wall, trying to make a quick change. Crowds running to the scene of the last fight, so whoever was involved can get their quick fame. Oh man, it's so insane.
Thanks so much for listening to my story. Feel free to check out the links above and see you later.